Imagine trying to grow enough food for a massive city. But there is almost no dry land left. You could clear forests, you could build terraces into mountains, or you could do something that sounds completely impossible. You could build farmland directly on a lake. More than 700 years ago, farmers in the Valley of Mexico did exactly that. They created rectangular gardens in shallow lake waters, surrounded them with canals, filled them with nutrient-rich mud, and turned wetlands into some of the most productive farmland of the ancient world. These remarkable agricultural plots were called chinampas. And what makes them even more fascinating is that they weren't simply floating gardens, as they are sometimes described. They were carefully engineered pieces of land, designed to work with water instead of fighting it. And the secret to their success begins with something every gardener understands: soil. The Valley of Mexico was surrounded by lakes, including the freshwater lakes of Xochimilco and Chalco. Long before the Aztec Empire reached its height, local farmers were already experimenting with ways to cultivate these shallow waters. They would mark out a rectangular area and create an underwater fence using reeds, stakes, branches, and other plant material. Then came the most important part. They filled the enclosed space with layers of lake sediment, mud, aquatic vegetation, and other organic material. Layer after layer, the ground was built upward until it rose above the surface of the water. What looked like a simple patch of farmland was actually a carefully constructed agricultural system. And then the farmers added another clever detail: trees. Willows were often planted around the edges and corners of the chinampa. Their roots helped hold the soil together and anchor the raised plot. Now the farmer had something extraordinary: a raised bed surrounded by water with its own natural irrigation system. The canals between the plots weren't wasted space. They were part of the farm. Canoes could travel through them, carrying farmers and produce. At the same time, the nearby water kept the soil consistently moist. That meant crops didn't have to depend entirely on rainfall. And this is where the Chinampa system becomes truly impressive. Instead of constantly bringing fertilizer from somewhere else, farmers could collect nutrient-rich mud from the canals and place it back onto the growing beds. The ditch became clogged with sediment. The farmer cleared it. And where did that nutrient-rich material go? Back onto the farm. The waste from one part of the system became a resource for another. Even today, research has found that cultivated Chinampa soils can contain diverse bacterial communities associated with nutrient cycling. In other words, the soil wasn't just holding plants, it was alive with biological activity, and the farmers didn't rely on just one crop. Maize, beans, and squash were particularly important. Together, these plants created a remarkably efficient partnership. Corn provided a structure for climbing beans. Beans helped replace nitrogen in the soil, and the broad leaves of squash shaded the ground, helping retain moisture while suppressing weeds. But these weren't the only crops. Chinampas could produce tomatoes, chili peppers, amaranth, flowers, and other vegetables. The result was not a field devoted to one crop. It was a miniature ecosystem. And because water was always nearby, these raised beds could remain productive through changing conditions. Some Chinampas were capable of producing multiple harvests in a year, with sources reporting as many as 7 harvests under suitable conditions. That productivity became extremely important as the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan expanded. The Aztecs did not invent Chinampa agriculture. The technique existed before their empire and was practiced by communities around the southern lakes of the Valley of Mexico. But the Aztecs expanded the system on a much larger scale. As the city grew, so did the demand for food. And instead of looking only toward distant farmland, agriculture could be pushed into the watery landscape surrounding the city. Thousands of productive chinampas surrounded Tenochtitlan and other settlements. The lake itself had become part of the agricultural infrastructure. And there was another advantage. The canals weren't only useful for farming, they also provided access to aquatic resources. Farmers could catch fish, frogs, turtles, and waterfowl in the surrounding waters. Lake Texcoco also provided algae that we now know as spirulina, so one landscape could provide crops from the soil and food from the water. But the system required constant care. Chinampas were not magical islands that could simply be built and forgotten. Farmers had to maintain the canals, replenish the soil, control vegetation, and protect the structure of the beds. The entire system depended on people understanding how water, plants, soil, and organic matter interacted. And eventually, that relationship was disrupted. During the Spanish conquest, dams and water control structures were destroyed, and many chinampas were abandoned. Over the centuries, drainage, urban expansion, pollution, changing water supplies, and other pressures reduced the agricultural landscape dramatically. But chinampas never completely disappeared. In parts of Xochimilco and surrounding areas, farmers still cultivate surviving plots today. Modern chinampas can produce lettuce, spinach, cilantro, chard, squash, parsley, cauliflower, celery, mint, corn, radishes, herbs, and flowers. And this is perhaps the most fascinating part of the story. What once looked like an ancient farming technique is now attracting attention as an example of sustainable agriculture. Because the basic idea is incredibly simple. Don't waste what the farm produces. Water supports the farm. The canals collect sediment. The sediment returns to the soil. Plants grow. Plant material decomposes. Nutrients move through the system again. Instead of treating the farm as a factory that constantly needs outside inputs, the chinampa works more like a living cycle. That doesn't mean it is a perfect solution for every modern farm. Attempts to reproduce chinampa systems elsewhere have faced challenges, and modern farmers in Xochimilco also deal with pollution, urbanization, limited water supplies, pesticides, and climate change. But the principle remains powerful. For centuries, these farmers understood something modern agriculture is still trying to perfect. Productivity doesn't always require conquering nature. Sometimes the smartest approach is to understand the environment so well that you can make the environment work with you. The Chinampas transformed shallow wetlands into fertile farmland. They connected soil and water. They turned sediment into fertilizer. They created growing spaces where there seemed to be no land available. And most importantly, they show us that agricultural innovation isn't always about bigger machines or more chemicals. Sometimes innovation begins with looking at an impossible landscape and asking a very simple question: how can we grow here? The answer, in the Valley of Mexico, was extraordinary. They didn't drain the lake and abandon it. They built farms inside it. And centuries later, those surviving gardens still remind us that some of the most ingenious farming ideas in human history were created with little more than reeds, mud, trees, water, and generations of careful observation.